It preconceives the way people see you. That's the problem, because it's all made up, but it's very real.
I'm Athena Brensberger. Welcome to Suppressed Science. The notion of race has played a powerful and vastly destructive role throughout history and across the globe. It has been the basis for caste systems, the excuse for atrocities, the cause of wars, genocides, and the scapegoated justification for subjugation of entire continents. Given how powerful of a force this concept has been throughout history, and the many dramatic and pervasive ways in which it impacts the lives of literally billions of people, it might come as a surprise that when it comes to breaking down the actual biological science of race, it turns out there really isn't any. It doesn't exist. If that sounds surprising or unbelievable to you, just consider that the notion of race arose in an era that predates any of the modern understanding of genetics and biology. By the end of this episode, you will understand exactly why race is not an actual biological concept, but rather a social and a political one. And most exciting of all, we'll learn about how a new generation of biotech and data-driven genomics is poised to rewrite and revolutionize the field in a way that will finally allow for science to reflect the complex tapestry of humanity, rather than the errors of our history. Pretty big question. Can you walk me through the history of the concept of race?
Okay, this is a big question. I think a lot of people imagine race to be this eternal quantity that we've always thought about, that has always existed, that resides within ourselves. Actually, it's historical. It's a social construct. Around the time of the Enlightenment, scientists, anatomists, and taxonomists started to look at the natural world and ask if we can classify people in the same way that they started to classify animals and plants. And that was when the idea of race as we now use it really became hardened.
While it was already tragic that the empirical science of the era was muddied by the politics of power and oppression, the true tragedy would be the ways in which these pseudoscientific ideas would be used to justify centuries of injustice.
So my name's Alan Goodman, and I'm a professor of biological anthropology at Hampshire College. I've long been interested in the concept of race and why it's persisted as a concept, even though race as biology is a myth. In the colonies, there was a need by slave owners to kind of keep their enslaved Africans separate from indentured Europeans and from Native Americans. So in the 1680s in Virginia, race for the first time became a legal entity to keep African Americans separate in power, in reproduction from those indentured Europeans from Ireland. And first they looked at cranial shapes and things of that sort, and then into the 20th century, looked at sort of genetic markers and blood groups and things of that sort, but they could never show that races were truly based on biology.
So for hundreds of years, researchers, physicians, scientists used these ideas as the basis for inquiry. And that led to all kinds of nonsense research. For example, in the 19th century, there was this ridiculous claim made by an American physician, Samuel Cartwright, that he coined this disease called drapetomania, which essentially described the phenomenon, or what he saw as a medical phenomenon, of black slaves running away from their white masters. Because in the race science lexicon of that day, slavery was seen to be part of the nature of being black. So that was a kind of madness that surrounded the idea of race right from the beginning. The surprising thing is that scientists ran with it. In the early 20th century, there was a movement known as eugenics. It was an ideologically informed pseudoscience that claimed there were some people who were genetically over generations inferior to other people. And much of the focus of early eugenicists was on class. They thought that right at the bottom of society, there was what they sometimes called the residuum. So people who were criminally inclined, less intelligent, just full of genetic defects that they were passing on to their children, and that their lives would never improve, even over generations, because they were destined to be like this forever. That idea of thinking about class, of thinking that poor people are just genetically inferior to rich people, we don't do that now. Scientists, is very unusual, in fact, vanishingly impossible to find a scientist who will make that claim now. But 100 years ago, they were doing that. Now, if we could just do the same with race, if we could understand that race, just like class or socioeconomic status, is a socially defined category.
So if the pseudoscience of race traces back to the pre-colonial era, when did real science begin to reveal the flaws in racist historical thinking? And how long has the old world view continued to suppress what should be a more nuanced modern understanding?
1972, what Richard Lewontin published an article called The Apportionment of Human Variation. And for the first time, anybody took a huge amount of data on human variation, mostly blood group variation. And he statistically looked at variation divided into three different ways. Variation within any local group, variation between local groups, but within the continent or race, and then variation between the continents. And at that point, most people thought, well, there'll be a lot of genetic variation, blood group variation between the continents. What Lewontin found is that the variation between the continents was about 6% of the entire variation. And so at that point, Lewontin basically declared that, okay, now genetically we know the race concept is dead. It does not hold any water.
Here's the crux of the matter. You walk down the street in the US, and you're like, oh, that person's white, that person's black, that person's Asian. What do those categories mean? Do they mean, like when you say that person's white, are you saying there is a biological thing of hair, of skin color, of eyes, of height, of body shape that is found only in that assortment in this one place in the world? That's what you think. That's not true. There's not a single gene that identifies someone as black, white, or Asian. There's not a skin color that identifies someone as black, white, or Asian, which is funny because we use skin color to identify those things. So for example, dark skin, very dark skin, is found in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Southern America. Are those people all the same race? Are people from India and Pakistan who are very dark and people from, let's say, West Africa who are very dark, are we going to say they're the same race as opposed to someone who's very light from England and someone who's very light from Mongolia?
Okay, let's break down what exactly we mean when we say that race is not a biological concept. You might think, white parents have white kids, black parents have black kids. These are physical characteristics you can see with your eyes, so they must be biological, right? Yes, traits like skin color, hair type, height, and so on are in fact biological and inherited. But the concept of race does not correspond to any specific genetic trait or even any specific combination of genetic traits. If you pick any biological trait or any combination of genes and look to see how it divides humanity, you'll find that the set of people it includes or excludes will not align with the preconceived notions of race. In other words, if you go looking for the genes which define whiteness or blackness or Asianness as general categories, you won't find them. What you'll actually find are genes that correspond to much more narrowly defined groups and lineages, and a complex interconnected web that mirrors the long and constant history of gene sharing across populations globally. Most importantly, what you'll find is that all humans are 99.9% genetically identical, and the bit of variation that does exist exists primarily at the individual level, not at the group level, and definitely not in a way that maps cleanly onto any socially constructed concept like nationality, religion, or race.
The biological race concept has a history and a place in biology that is associated with the evolutionary process of speciation. And so there are large-bodied mammals that are genetically distant, have more genetic variation between their groups than within them, have unique evolutionary lineages, but we are not one of those species. The first 200,000 of the years in which anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, has existed, were all spent in a confined region of sub-Saharan Africa. And it's only after the last ice age begins to recede that humans began to migrate out of Africa and spread around the world. But during that time, the amount of movement between populations and gene flow was such that we never really developed or evolved unique lineages.
You know, where do you draw the line between Europe and Asia, right? We draw political lines there. They're not clear geographic boundaries. So if you were to look at the peoples, the populations that live, let's say, stretching from Western Europe, Central Europe, Central Asia, all the way to East Asia, and you were to walk along there and you were to look for some characteristic change in skin or eyes or hair or body form, you'd keep looking and you'd be like, oh, where do I draw the line? Where do I draw the line? We draw the line. We decide what race is, just the way we decide what countries are and where those borders are. And borders change. So think about the United States. Most people think of Hispanic or Latinx as a race. You actually derive from all of these different places around the planet. You're Black, you're white, you're indigenous, all of these kinds of things fall under the term Hispanic or Latino, Latina, Latinx. It just goes to show our categories of race are constructed. They do not actually speak to the diversity and the spread and divisions of biological variation in humans.
That in the Western world, so much of our understanding of humans is driven by blatant white supremacy and white normality. People think that the phenotype of Northern Europeans somehow is superior and natural in the way things were supposed to be, when in fact it's a very recent phenotype. For the vast majority of the existence of our species, there were no fair-skinned individuals. That complexion, even 10,000 years ago, is something that occurred in very recent human history. But because persons of that portion of the world took over the world, they changed the discussion and the understanding of our species, normalizing their characteristics. God, for example, becomes white. Most Americans today are still special creationists. We've actually surveyed people on their adherence to the out of Africa science, where all humans evolved in Africa and then migrated around the world. The vast majority of Americans don't accept it.
What? Wait, do we have a statistic?
Yes, the vast majority of Americans do not accept out of Africa.
Because race is a real constructed, historical, political, lived experience. It matters when you walk down the street if you're white or Black or Latino, right? Depending on how you're categorized.
The balance between respecting heritage, culture, and identity, while also avoiding the pitfalls that come with false beliefs about biological race, can be a difficult one to strike. And it turns out that much of the suppression of new understanding comes from large institutional practices and the established norms of massive industries.
Medicine is one of those fields that keeps race science alive, perhaps more than any other, because it's quite routine in certain countries for people to use race inappropriately when they're talking about biological differences and health differences. Now, there are health differences between Black Americans and white Americans. In fact, there's quite a large life expectancy gap between Black Americans and white Americans, but there is no reason to assume that that life expectancy gap is because people are fundamentally on the inside different. What we do see globally is a life expectancy gap between the rich and the poor, which has actually been getting wider over the last 10 years. Nobody biologizes this. Nobody says poor people have different genes and that's why they're not living longer.
So my name is Adrian Zerka. I'm a pediatric intensivist, so I work in the intensive care unit with children. One of my areas of interest and I guess areas of expertise is in thinking through some of the challenges that patients or families of color that are either non-English speaking interact with the medical system.
Is it fair to say that medical research and practice have not been immune to racism?
Absolutely. So race has been part of medicine since the very beginning. And the idea of having, of kind of differentiating people and the idea that people act differently, that their biology is different because of the color of their skin or where they're from is something that goes back to like Greek ages. And that's something that unfortunately has kind of permeated its way through kind of the modern era. And so when people have looked at health outcomes, then, you know, they find that Black people, Hispanic people have poorer health outcomes, but they haven't necessarily been taking the time to dig down into the why of all that. And up until relatively recently, a lot of the why was just kind of this assumption that there are biologic differences.
Most people are like, oh, sickle cell, it's a disease, happens if you're African ancestry or you have sickle cell trait, and that's not true at all. Clearly evolved as an adaptation to endemic malaria. It evolved in different parts of the world. It did evolve in West Central Africa, but you have high levels of sickle cell in part of India, the Arabian Peninsula, part of the Mediterranean. You don't have any sickle cell in South and North Africa. It's got nothing to do with race. It just so happens that a lot of the individuals with sickle cell in the United States that we saw came enslaved from West Africa.
The way that we, at least the most common way of us in medicine of checking what somebody's kidney function is by testing or by checking a level of something called a creatinine in the blood. When muscles are broken down, it creates creatinine. Your kidneys get rid of it. The lower your creatinine, the more your kidneys are getting rid of it, the better your kidney function is. But there's algorithms or calculations that actually turn creatinine level into kidney function. There was a theory that Black people had higher muscle mass. That's part of who they are. They biologically have more muscle mass. That was kind of the theory, and there was maybe some soft data for that. So that means that when people developed these calculations, they then included Black race as a kind of another variable. So somebody whose creatinine level is X, well, if that person is listed as Black, they're willing to accept a higher creatinine level, which then means that person's kidney function will be listed as being better. And why does this matter? So that means that we're under-recognizing how poor certain Black patients' kidney function is. And that means that they may be, that Black people may be less likely to get referral to a kidney specialist. They may be less likely to be on the kidney transplant list. They may be less likely to get dialysis because they're just not, the algorithm is already kind of within it, there's racism entrenched in there.
Yeah, so instead of looking at a patient and their generalized race group, actually really break it down, go into the details of where they're from, where their ancestors come from, and then make a derived result, because that can really change a patient's outlook, not just their future, but just personally speaking, as a patient who goes to see a doctor, as we all are, maybe going and thinking, oh, because I'm this, I must have that. And they can say to me, actually, no, just because you're white doesn't mean you might be more prone to something like this disease. In fact, you actually don't fall into these specific categories from this region on the planet. So you're actually fine. And that can really transform and change, I think, not only the outlook of the patient, but the medical practice as a whole, and also just sort of humanity really as a whole too, because we'll actually start to look at the things that have relevance and matter when it comes to medical practice, as opposed to things that truly do not have any evidence or documentary backup.
Genomic science is the branch of biology concerned with the structure, function, and mapping of the full genetic information of individuals. While the theory and research in this area has existed for over a century, it is only in recent years that modern computing methods have set off a revolution in the power and insight available through genomics.
I think, maybe too optimistically, that big data and genomic science over the next couple decades is going to just quash the biological race concept. It's just going to smash it so deep into the ground that it's totally insupportable. The threat of knowing more about genetics and having more discrimination is, I think, a political threat. That is, you could, for example, screen for likelihood of breast cancer. You could screen for certain likelihoods of diabetes. You could screen for certain possibilities of certain genetic disorders. And I'm afraid, more and more that genetics will be used by insurance companies, by medical providers, by schools, by communities, who knows, to filter who can be in and who can be out. That's really dangerous. That's my fear. When you're thinking about sort of what the future of our understanding of genomics and how that maps to human diversity and what that means, right? How do we interpret all this big data in the genomics? Well, you need to talk to Keolu Fox. He is doing the research and the innovation and the sort of cutting edge work that's going to get you these really interesting answers.
Coming from an indigenous group myself, as a Native Hawaiian person, I've always been intrigued in a few basic questions. In fact, we had a paper that came out in the journal Nature today using modern genome sequence data to recapitulate our voyaging history as the most badass watermen, women, voyaging community in history. We were able to understand island hopping models and use complex mathematics to recapitulate the timing of our diaspora. I think that this is a very subtle, volatile, but also hopeful field, and it's something that's really important to everyone's identities. It's important to think about providing names and creating categories for things. When you bin things or you lump and split things, the real important prospect and idea here is who is in the position of power, who is doing the naming. Why don't you just ask people what they call themselves? We're not calling ourselves Native Hawaiian. We call ourselves, historically for thousands of years, Kanaka Maoli. They don't call themselves Tahitian. They call themselves Pamotu and the Tuamotus. And they don't call themselves Navajo. They call themselves Dene. And these are distinctions that indigenous people know, but because of the colonial gaze and the way that we create categories, because when you name something, it either provides or takes away agency. So there are basic things that we can do in the way that we recategorize and rename data sets that already exist, and in the way that we divvy up and lump and split and build data sets in the future. Let's talk about the term Black to describe descendants of the transatlantic slave trade in the United States of America, or is it used to describe the whole continent of Africa, the cradle of humanity, the most genetically diverse place on Earth? You see how a term like Black is limiting, but in the case of describing data and variation in data, we lose a lot of information in the process. It's not just biological information, but it's also cultural information.
Scientific knowledge has always been in the service of those who control society. To the degree to which scientists, claim independence from that, I say no. There are some of us who have always tried, but the simple fact of the matter is that the scientific enterprise serves capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism. Always has.
Mm-hmm.
People are patenting, cashing in on, selling genomic data. So for example, a recent suit was just brought from the Gila line, right? Henrietta Lacks, a woman who did not give permission, right, for her cell lines to go into experimental use, is in some of the vaccines and all of these other great innovations scientifically that we have, but they were used without her permission. In the COVID outbreak, as horrible as it was, the science of collaboration, the sharing of the genetic sequences of the viruses, that has been a breakthrough that has changed the game for understanding open access and shared genetic information. So I'm hoping that the corporate drive to make cash off of DNA is outweighed by the health benefits, the social benefits, and just the cool science of sharing knowledge about DNA.
When you know that data is the #1 resource on planet Earth, surpassing oil in 2018, and we know what the largest companies in the world are now, GDP, it's Amazon, it's Facebook, it's Google. That empire is built on data itself as a resource. So if we're taking data from human beings, and that's what we do, we take blood or any other kind of DNA and we convert it into digital information, because that's what genome sequencing does, then how does that not fit neatly into that big data surveillance ecosystem, that economy? How is this not just another resource that's extracted?
The question for me as a journalist is always, why do we still not believe this? Why do we still seem so resistant, even though there is such consensus on this, even though we know, all these scientists are constantly writing this all the time for us, reminding us, they have been for most of the time that most of us have been alive, and yet we don't fully accept it. And I think that's because it isn't just about the science or the history. It's also about the narratives that we build around identity and belonging. It's about the stories we tell ourselves.